Now, the discussion for tonight is Africa, Time of Trouble, the coming of the Europeans. Very few people talk about this subject from an African point of view, because the coming of the Europeans, not only to Africa, but the coming of the Europeans to the world was disaster. And yet, when you read the history books, the assumption is that the coming of the Europeans was the bringing of the light. And yet, everywhere he went in the world, he put out the light. He brought no civilization to anybody, anywhere, any place in the world. Now, I am reversing history, and if I couldn't prove it, I wouldn't be saying it. First place, you have to deal with something in one of the great myths in human history, and that is the myth of the invader as civilizer and conqueror. No people ever conquered, invaded any people for the sake of civilizing them. This is true. This is even true when blacks are invading blacks. This is true across the board. This is true every time in history. Now, I can point to what seemed to be an exception, and if you bend history a little bit, you can make it an exception. But you'll be making it an exception, but if you look well, there's not an exception at all. When the Kushites invaded Egypt and created the mighty 25th dynasty, they improved Egypt. They put Egypt's house in order, and they gave Egypt her last walk in the sun. Here was a case where the invader did some good. Does that prove me wrong? No. I still maintain that the invader always does more harm than good. Then what am I talking about in this case? The invasion was not really an invasion in the true sense. The Kushites from the south were relatives of the Egyptians. They were African relatives invading the house of the relative and telling the relative, put your house in order before the foreigners come back here and take over both of us. So it was not an invasion in the true sense, because those in the south was just as much of the north as the others. And when they invaded, the question of the three great generals that invaded Castor, Pianki, Tahaka was, are you obeying the old religion? Are you true to the great religions of the river? And they asked them, are you obeying the laws and the moral laws laid down by the last great goddess of the Nile Valley, the woman goddess Maya? Are you true to her teachings? Now, when you look today and see all the people hung up called women's lib, these black men, 751 BC, asking other black people, are you obeying the moral laws laid down by a woman? This will blow the white people's mind. Today, how about women's white equality? When these people wanted to know whether you obeying a black woman who was a god. And they worried about whether they should elect a white woman as the executive. They're talking about equality. And they were talking about gods. These people so far behind us, it ain't even a pity. Now, when you analyze what I'm talking about, I've showed you an exception. But when you analyze it, it wasn't an invasion at all. Just one relative trying to put another relative's house in order. Because it wasn't an invasion at all, because the South and the North was one and the same. I can show you another example outside of Egypt. The African invasion of Spain. The Africans, Berbers, and Arabs gave Spain the greatest material civilization it ever had before or since. Yet, the Africans, Berbers, and Arabs so depressed Iberian or Spanish culture to the point it hasn't recovered to this very day. If you go to Spain right now, when they point to some achievement, it is some achievement the Moors left behind. They still hadn't recovered. I say every invader depresses the culture of a people and takes more away, ultimately, than they give. I'm talking about the Europeans coming to the world, doing the whole world more harm than good. And if he say he is the bringer of the light, he is a liar and a hypocrite, because he brought no light, he put out the light. And that he is in a position right now of losing the world, and each time he called an age his golden age is that age when he has somebody else to exploit outside of Europe. And that he never had a golden age when he had only Europe to feed on. He is being pushed right now to a point where he is being deprived of the land and the resources outside of Europe, when he would rather blow up the world if he can't rule it. And so the people of the world had better protect themselves or prepare to go back in chains, because he'd rather enslave it or destroy it if he can't rule it. All right, now let us look at the world of Africa and Asia, but principally Africa, before that European came out of that box the second time. All right. The first time he was pushed back into Europe,